Married 6 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. You know what's interesting, Margaret? I said, my voice calm despite the storm inside me. When Michael and I were married, you told me family was everything. That loyalty and honesty were the foundations of a lasting relationship. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle into the silence on the other end of the line. I wonder what you'll say when you find out how your son and my sister portrayed those values. There was a long silence. Then, finally, she asked, what do you mean? Ask them, I replied. Ask them about the photos they doctored. Ask about the false testimony. The manufactured evidence they used to paint me as unstable. Another pause. Better yet, I said, voice steady. Ask them about the affair they were having while Michael and I were still married. I heard a sharp intake of breath. No, she whispered. They wouldn't. They did, I said simply. And now they're about to learn that actions have consequences. I hung up and drove to my grandmother's house, my house now. Though Sarah didn't know that yet. The Grand Victorian stood silent and dignified, its tall windows reflecting the fading light of late afternoon. I slid my key into the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old books and lemon-scented furniture polish. In the study, everything remained exactly as my grandmother had left it. Her reading glasses still rested beside a half-finished crossword puzzle on the desk. I ran my fingers along the spines of her beloved books, remembering the countless hours we'd spent together in that room. I miss you, I whispered to the empty space. I wish you could see this. My phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Chen. Quarterly statement sent. Expect contact within 24 hours. I smiled faintly and settled into grandmother's favorite armchair. The wait wouldn't be long now. Then I heard it, a car screeching to a halt outside. Footsteps thundered up the front steps. A moment later, a pounding erupted at the door. Emma, Sarah's voice was shrill, almost frantic. Open this door right now. We need to talk. I didn't move. I listened as Michael's voice joined hers. The accounts are empty, he said. Everything's gone. How could this happen? Nothing's gone. I called through the door, loud enough for them to hear. It was never there to begin with. The pounding stopped. Silence. Then Sarah's voice again, quieter now, uncertain. What are you talking about? Maybe you should ask your fiancé about due diligence. I replied, about checking the real value of what you thought you were stealing before spending money you didn't have. Another long silence followed. I could hear them whispering urgently outside, panic, confusion, desperation. Their perfect world was beginning to crack. Emma, please, Michael said finally. He used the gentle, coaxing tone he'd always reserved for manipulation. Let's discuss this like adults. I'm sure we can work something out. I stood and walked to the door. But I didn't open it. Like we discussed things when you were sleeping with my sister? I said. Or when you lied in court about my mental health. That was a mistake. He stammered. We never meant to get caught. I finished for him. To face consequences. Well, too bad, I said, voice calm and cold, because that's exactly what's about to happen. The fallout began swiftly and without mercy. Within hours of discovering the accounts were empty, Sarah and Michael's carefully constructed world began to collapse. I watched from the window of the study as they argued on the front lawn. Sarah's perfect makeup was smeared with tears, her gestures wild and erratic. Michael paced back and forth, raking his hands through his hair, his face lined with frustration and disbelief. My phone lit up again. A new message from Mr. Chen. The bank is requesting an immediate meeting regarding the recent expenditures. Shall I arrange it? Yes, I replied, and make sure all relevant parties are present. The next morning, I walked into the downtown branch of First National Bank, wearing one of grandmother's vintage Chanel suits. The scent of her perfume still lingered faintly on the collar. Sarah and Michael were already seated at the conference table, alongside their lawyer and Margaret. Their faces twisted when they saw me enter, a blend of disbelief, fear, and growing dread. Now that everyone's here, the bank manager began. We need to address the irregular activity on these accounts. Sarah's lawyer leaned forward. My clients were granted access through a valid court order. Everything was done legally. The court order, I interrupted, placing grandmother's journal on the table, was obtained using fraudulent evidence. Evidence we can now prove was manipulated. Gasps filled the room, but I didn't look away. Their time was up. The next hour was excruciating for them. Not for me. Mr. Chen spoke with practiced calm. laying out every detail, the doctored photos, the false testimonies, the careful, deliberate character assassination they had orchestrated to gain control of what they believed was grandmother's fortune. Every piece of their deception unraveled under the fluorescent lights of the bank's conference room. The real estate alone, Mr. Chen concluded, glancing at the paperwork before him. The properties they leveraged for loans, none of it was actually in the accounts they accessed. Those assets are held in a separate trust, one that requires both sisters' consent for any transaction. Michael's face had turned an interesting shade of gray. But the money we spent, he began, was essentially credit, the bank manager finished, extended by the bank based on assets you didn't actually control. Which means those loans are now in default. Sarah's fingers gripped the edge of the table. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the polished wood. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Emma's just trying to hurt us because she's jealous. Michael chose me, and she can't handle it. I turned to face her and really looked. Beyond the designer dress and diamond earrings. Beyond the rehearsed outrage and entitlement. I saw what grandmother must have seen long ago, a desperate woman. So determined to take what others had that she never learned how to build anything of her own. No, Sarah, I said quietly. This isn't about jealousy. It's about justice. About consequences. Grandmother knew what you were capable of, both of you. She planned for this. What do you mean? Margaret asked, speaking for the first time. I opened the journal to a marked page and slid it toward the center of the table. This is grandmother's real will. Her actual intentions. Everything of value was placed in a trust before she died. With specific conditions. I looked directly at Sarah. She knew you'd try to take it all. She wanted to see what you'd do. How far you'd go. Michael's voice broke the silence. And now what? You're going to take everything? Leave us with nothing? No, I replied. I'm going to do what grandmother would have wanted. I pulled out a folder from my briefcase, an official document prepared by Mr. Chen. The trust will remain intact. But with new conditions. If you both sign this confession, admitting to your fraud and manipulation, the trust will assist in paying off the debts you've incurred. Sarah's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but she cut him off with a glance. And if we don't sign? She asked. Then the bank proceeds with fraud charges. I said, and all the evidence of your deception goes public. I let that sink in. Your choice. The silence that followed was complete. No protests, no pleading. Just the sound of reality finally setting in. Margaret was the first to speak. Her voice was tight, clipped, but resolute. Sign it, she said to Michael, not even looking at Sarah. And be grateful your grandmother's granddaughter has more mercy than either of you deserve. One by one, they signed. Sarah's hand shook so violently that she could barely hold the pen. Michael wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. When it was done, Mr. Chen collected the documents and gave me a small nod. There's one more thing, I said, standing. I looked directly at Sarah. Her hand had instinctively moved to cover it. The engagement ring, I said simply. She froze. That ring belonged to grandmother. It was never yours to take. Slowly, reluctantly, Sarah slipped it off her finger and placed it on the table. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, feeling the familiar weight of it. Grandmother once told me this ring wasn't just about value. I said, it was about legacy, about the kind of person you choose to be. She wore it for 50 years. Building a life founded on integrity and wisdom. I met their eyes. You both could have learned from her example. Instead, you chose greed. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving them behind in that sterile conference room, ashamed, exposed, broken. The ride home was quiet. The city passed by in a blur of sunlight and shadows. When I arrived at grandmother's house, my house, I went straight to the study and sat in her favorite chair. I slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly, just as she'd said it would. On the desk, beside the unfinished crossword puzzle, I noticed an envelope I hadn't seen before. It was addressed to me in grandmother's handwriting. Inside was a short note. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then everything has played out as I expected. Remember that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in who you choose to be. You've proven yourself worthy of not just my inheritance, but of my legacy. The ring is yours now. Wear it with pride, knowing that you faced adversity with grace and emerged stronger. And perhaps someday, when the time is right, you'll pass these lessons on to someone who needs them as much as you once did. With all my love. Grandmother rose. I sat there until the sun set, thinking about choices and consequences, about the price of greed and the value of integrity. Sarah and Michael would recover, eventually. That much I knew. The trust, even under the new conditions, would ensure they didn't end up destitute. But they would never again have the power to hurt me. That, in itself, was a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. Months passed. I heard through quiet sources, Margaret. Mostly, that they'd moved to another state. Their engagement had ended quietly. With no announcement or fanfare. No one asked why, and no one needed to. People talk, even when they think they're being discreet. Margaret sent me a Christmas card. Inside was a handwritten message. Thank you for handling things with more grace than they deserved. I hope you're doing well, Emma. It was simple, but sincere. A step, perhaps, toward some kind of understanding. Sarah never reached out again. Not a call, not a message, nothing. And that, I decided, was fine. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ashes. The house, grandmother's house, became my sanctuary. Every room held a memory. The scent of lavender sachets in the linen closets. The worn armrest of her favorite chair. The way the light filtered through the stained glass window above the staircase. I didn't change much. It felt like she was still there. Just in the next room. Quietly reading or humming to herself while tending to her plants. I turned her study into the heart of my life. It wasn't just a room anymore, it was a mission. One evening, I sat at her desk. Ring on my finger. Note beside me. And I knew I had to do something more than just keep the inheritance. I needed to carry her legacy forward in a meaningful way. That's how the Rose Foundation began. At first, it was modest. Just a small scholarship fund to support young women pursuing education. Particularly those facing obstacles like I once had. But word spread. People believed in it. Donations came in. We partnered with schools, organizations, and counselors who worked with at-risk youth. The foundation grew. And with it, so did my sense of purpose. Every time I signed a check for a new scholarship. Every time I spoke to a recipient who reminded me of the girl I used to be. I thought of grandmother. Her wisdom, her foresight, her understanding of human nature. She had built so much more than a fortune. She had built a legacy. One rooted in integrity, vision, and strength. I wore her ring every day. It became a symbol, not just of what I had survived, but of who I had become. Sometimes, I wondered what might have happened if Sarah and Michael had made different choices. If they had chosen truth over deceit, love over ambition, but I didn't dwell on it. I couldn't. Their choices were their own. And so were the consequences. One spring afternoon, while sorting through one of grandmother's old file cabinets, I came across a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They were love letters, from her younger years. Pages and pages filled with warmth, hope, and reflections on love, loyalty, and the future. She had been someone's muse, someone's dream, and even in her own youth, she had written like someone already wise beyond her years. In one of the letters, she wrote, I believe the world breaks us in quiet ways, testing our hearts with disappointment and betrayal. But those who choose kindness, again and again, despite it all, those are the ones who build something lasting. That is who I want to be. Reading it felt like discovering a piece of her I hadn't known. The girl behind the legacy. The woman who built a life on values that money could never buy. I placed the letter back in its envelope, heart aching with gratitude. Grandmother had given me so much more than assets. She had given me a compass. One morning, I walked through the neighborhood. Now familiar and dear. The neighbors had started to wave when I passed. Some even stopped to chat. To them, I was no longer the girl who vanished after a messy divorce or the woman wronged by her sister. I was Emma Rose, founder of the Rose Foundation, resident of the grand old Victorian on the hill. I had found my place again. Back at the house, I opened the windows to let the breeze in. The curtains danced in the sunlight. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, not a dramatic change, but a quiet release. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, they no longer defined me. They were chapters, not the whole story. The final word belonged to me. And that word was peace. I returned to the study and sat once more in grandmother's chair. On her desk sat the journal, the ring, and now, the stack of letters. Her life, her values, her love, they lived on. Not just through me, but through every young woman we helped. I opened my notebook and began to write, not for lawyers or courts, but for the next girl, the next Emma, who might one day find herself surrounded by shadows and searching for light. Because now, I had something to give. And that, I realized, was the truest kind of wealth. Even after everything settled, there were still quiet echoes. Not regrets, just reminders. Reminders that the people who once tried to break me hadn't succeeded. That the life I now lived was built not on revenge, but on resolution, on healing, on legacy. The Rose Foundation became more than I ever imagined. Applications poured in from young women across the country. Some were escaping abusive homes. Others were first-generation college students. A few had stories eerily like mine, betrayed by people they loved and learning to rebuild. For each one, we became a stepping stone towards something better. Every acceptance letter, every scholarship funded, felt like a silent conversation with grandmother. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" I'd think. Her voice, though never audible, always seemed to answer in my heart. Yes, this was exactly it. One rainy afternoon, I received a letter from one of our first recipients. Her name was Naomi, and she'd grown up in foster care. Bouncing from one home to another. Always told she wouldn't amount to much. With our scholarship, she had enrolled in a nursing program. She wrote, "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. I don't know your story, but I feel like you understand mine." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box in the study. The box was filling up, notes, cards, small tokens of thanks, each one a quiet affirmation that pain, when transformed, could become purpose. Still, there were days when shadows threatened. Not from Sarah or Michael, they had faded from my world, but from within. Healing wasn't a straight path. Some days I still heard Michael's voice in the back of my mind. Soft and manipulative. Some nights I dreamt of courtrooms and slammed doors and Sarah's cold eyes. But then I'd wake up and feel the ring on my finger. I'd walk downstairs and see grandmother's portrait above the mantel. I'd read Naomi's letter again, and I'd remember who I was now. Sometimes, life felt full of small, quiet victories, like the day the local paper interviewed me about the foundation, or when the city council honored grandmother posthumously for her philanthropic contributions. I accepted the plaque in her name. Hand steady, voice clear. She taught me that wealth isn't what you keep, I said to the room, but what you give. There were nods, applause, but the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a woman in her 60s approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "Your grandmother once helped my mother keep our home. I never forgot that kindness." It struck me how many lives grandmother had touched, often in ways I never knew. She hadn't just prepared for betrayal, she had lived a life of quiet generosity. I wasn't just her heir, I was her continuation. One evening, as spring returned, I stood at the front window of the house, watching a storm roll in. Thunder grumbled in the distance, and the trees danced in the wind. I remembered a time, not too long ago, when storms frightened me, when everything in my life felt like it might collapse at any second. But now, storms were just storms. They passed. That same night, I found a second envelope tucked deep within a drawer in the study. Smaller than the first, but unmistakably written in grandmother's hand. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. It read, "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this second letter, then you've already proven what I always believed, that your strength runs deeper than you know. You've faced betrayal, loss, and injustice, and still, you've chosen to stand with grace. That is no small thing. You have more than my blessing, you have my pride. There may come a time when someone else, perhaps someone unexpected, needs what you now carry. When that day comes, I hope you'll be ready to pass it on, not just the wealth, but the wisdom. Until then, live well, love honestly, and never forget that you are, and always were, enough. With all my love, Grandmother Rose." I sat with that letter in my lap for a long time, letting her words settle into my bones. There was something final about it, but not in a sorrowful way. It was closure, a chapter ending, but a new one beginning. In time, I framed the letter and hung it in the study, right above the desk. Visitors often asked about it. I'd smile and say, "It's a reminder from someone who taught me everything important." As months turned into years, the foundation continued to grow. We opened satellite offices, hired staff, established partnerships with universities. I met hundreds of young women, each one carrying their own story of resilience. Some even returned to work with us, their lives transformed by the very scholarships they once received. And me? I stayed in the house. I never needed to leave. It was where I became whole again. Every morning, I'd wake up, slip on the ring, and walk through rooms still filled with grandmother's books. Her scent, her quiet wisdom. Sometimes, I'd sit in the garden, coffee in hand, and watch the flowers bloom, thinking how beautiful it was that something could start over, grow again, even after being buried. They say legacy is what you leave behind. But I think it's more than that. It's what you carry forward. It's the way your story shapes someone else's path. It's choosing, even in the wake of betrayal, to be someone better. And that, I realized, was the final lesson. Grandmother didn't just leave me a trust or a ring or a house. She left me the tools to become the kind of woman no lie could diminish, no betrayal could define. She gave me the power to begin again. And I did.